Hello, everyone. This is Francesca Vigliani from Cloud Academy. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're truly looking forward to this webinar. So last week we were in Orlando for Microsoft Ignite, and we had a great time attending the keynote, talking to people at our booth, and sharing views with our attendees. Today we thought we'd bring together our experts to give you the Cloud Academy post-show lowdown, and who better than Guy Hummel and Thomas Mitchell to do this. Before I hand it over to them, I'd like to remind you that this is an interactive webinar and we'd be happy to hear from you. So at the end of this session, we will hold a Q&A. So please feel free to pop your questions in the chat box and we'll tackle them later. One final reminder before we get started, this webinar is being recorded and you will receive the recording as soon as it is available. All right, thank you again for joining us and over to you guys.
Thanks, Francesca. Again, my name's Tom Mitchell. I am an Azure trainer here at Cloud Academy, and I spent quite a bit of my time over the last week roaming the Ignite convention, stopping by our booth, and what we're going to do here is touch base on some of the more key announcements that happened during Ignite. And for me, the most significant was Azure Arc. This appears to be the biggest announcement that came out of Ignite 2019. Certainly for me, it was the most exciting announcement to come out of Ignite. And based on the buzz that it appears to be generating, it looks like the Azure Arc announcement is resonating with others as well. Azure Arc is a pretty cool, an exciting technology that kind of struck with me, because what it does is it extends the control plane of Azure to on-prem data centers, as well as other cloud platforms like AWS and Google, and also to the edge. What it essentially does is, while you have lots of organizations trying to extend their data centers into Azure, this almost does the reverse, where it allows you to extend Azure into your data center and to your other cloud platforms that you might be working with. It essentially provides a central self-service approach to management of Windows VMs, Linux VMs, Kubernetes clusters, and even other Azure data services, regardless of where they're located. It really is a cool feature, and in some of the demonstrations I watched, it allowed, what it actually did was allow an organization to even take Azure policies and apply them down to resources located in a physical data center. It also allowed you to deploy resources using the typical Azure portal, but to deploy those resources into a data center or even to an AWS environment. It also allows organizations, what I should say is it provides organizations with automated patching, upgrades and security. And there were also some demonstrations that just allowed an organization to on-demand scale resources, whether they're on-prem, in the edge, or in a multi-cloud environment. It was a really exciting technology that essentially extends Azure management across environments. I guess the last real interesting piece about Azure Arc is the ability to implement Azure security pretty much anywhere. What it allows you to do is leverage Azure security capabilities like Azure threat detection, and allows you to centrally manage access and security policies for resources with role-based access control. So it really does extend the Azure portal or Azure services down into your data center or down into whatever cloud you're using currently. So it is truly a way to get into that full, I guess, hybrid mode or multi-cloud environment that a lot of organizations are looking for. And I think Guy is going to talk a little bit about Azure Synapse, which was also another key announcement coming out of Ignite.
All right, thanks, Dom. I'm Guy Hummel, the Azure and Google Cloud Content Lead at Cloud Academy. And yeah, in my opinion, Azure Synapse Analytics was probably the second most important announcement at the show. And really, it's the evolution of Azure Data Warehouse. So Microsoft added so many new features and changed the product so fundamentally that they decided they needed to change the name of it even. So it is now Azure Synapse Analytics. And this is an image from Microsoft that attempts to show where it fits. And so you see that it's in the middle there, and on the left you have Power BI for presentations. On the right, you've got Azure Machine Learning, and above you have an ecosystem of other services and products, everything all tied together in one package. But really, even this doesn't fully show or explain just how much there is in Synapse Analytics. So I'll get into that now. And it's a little bit hard to explain because there's just so much going on actually. But the first thing is that there's now a new option, a serverless option with on-demand pricing. So the way that it worked before with SQL Data Warehouse is that you had to spin up an instance of Data Warehouse and you had to say how many Data Warehouse units you were going to provision. So you were basically setting the capacity of it up front. And then as long as it was running, you would be charged for it, regardless of whether you were actually using it or not, whether you were actually, say, making queries against it or not. And what they're doing now is they still have the original option, but they've added a new option in preview where you can just do everything completely on demand. So once you have your data in there, you can run queries against it whenever you want, and it's ready to go anytime, but you only get charged for the data that's processed in these queries. And probably one of the reasons why Microsoft did this is because to compete with things like, say, Google BigQuery, which that's the model that they use. So now with Synapse Analytics, you have both models. You can do it either way. And Microsoft refers to this as limitless scale because the way it was before, you had to decide what the scale was of your data warehouse. And now it's essentially limitless with the scale because Synapse will automatically provision as much as is needed to be able to handle the queries that you're sending it. Now, another big thing is that it handles not only its traditional data warehouse type queries with relational data, but it also handles data lakes. And so it does this by integrating Microsoft's Azure Data Lake Storage, which has been around for quite a while, but it's now an integral part of this, of Synapse, sorry. And so the other really interesting thing here is that they support SQL queries on both relational and unstructured data. So the relational data in the data warehouse, and you've always been able to do SQL queries against that. But now you can also do SQL queries against unstructured data in a data lake, which is a little bit unusual. And the idea is that they're trying to bring everything together in one place. And so to do this, they've integrated a whole bunch of other services that were previously essentially a loose collection of different services that you could kind of string together. Now they're much more tightly integrated with Synapse Analytics. And so that includes data lake storage, which I mentioned already for the unstructured data, Power BI for the presentation, Azure Machine Learning, Spark, which is an open source analytics and machine learning engine, Databricks, which is actually another implementation of Spark. So they actually have two different ways that you can integrate Spark. That's how important Spark is these days. And Data Factory, which is a really interesting one because it allows you to put together a data processing pipeline in a visual way. So you actually don't need to write any code. You can just do this on the screen in a browser. It's really nice. So that's getting integrated in as well. And I should mention that these features are in preview. Basically all of them, all the new features are in preview. So Synapse Analytics itself is in general availability, but it's still essentially just the old SQL data warehouse. And if you want access to these new features, then you need to sign up for the preview. Now, another feature that, and this one's really important, this is where everything comes together, is Azure Synapse Studio. And this is a nice browser-based visual way of doing data prep and management. And so you can do everything in here from ingesting the data, exploring it, analyzing it, and visualizing it. So all in one place, which, you know, it looks fantastic. All right, next one.
And I guess, you know, this one I'll kind of take here, and it's the Azure Stack Hub. Now, at Ignite 2019, Microsoft announced this new strategy that's basically intended to position Azure as the central place where you can manage edge, on-prem data centers, or even multi-cloud resources. Now, that being the case, there was a little bit of a rebrand that occurred. Azure Stack Hub is essentially what that does is it refers to what was originally Azure Stack. You can see here on the graphic here, Azure Stack Hub is the cloud native integrated system that provides, it works for disconnected scenarios, application modernization, and that stuff. Now, you also have Azure Stack now, which refers to the entire family of Stack offerings. They include the Stack Edge, Stack HCI, and then of course Azure Stack Hub. So you had basically an upbranding or a rebranding where you now have Stack Hub is a subproduct of the entire Azure Stack family. Now, certain updates that were specific to Azure Stack Hub that came out of Ignite include the preview of Windows Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack Hub and Azure Data Services, or Arc, on Azure Stack Hub. Now, Windows Virtual Desktop is being, I guess you could say, partially brought to the Azure Stack Hub. What this means is that the management pane for Windows Virtual Desktop will remain in Azure, but organizations will be able to host their Windows pools also on Azure Stack Hub. Now, with Azure Arc, customers that are looking to, I guess, simplify their environments across, on-prem environments, edge environments, or even on multi-cloud, they'll be able to use Azure Arc to deploy resources anywhere, including Azure Stack Hub. Another announcement that came out of 2019 was Azure Peering. It's essentially Microsoft announced this managed preview of its Azure Peering service. Now, what Azure Peering service is, it's essentially I guess you could say, a partnership with service providers. And what it does is it provides highly reliable and optimized internet connectivity back to the various Microsoft services. Now, the Azure Peering service is really intended for customers who have an internet-first network strategy for accessing Azure and some of the software as a service offerings like Office 365, for example. Now, though, by participating or really partnering with internet service providers, customers can take advantage of this optimized routing of their internet traffic to the Microsoft cloud. Now, in addition to the Peering and Arc, along with the Synapse, Azure Security Center saw some changes at Ignite as well. It's been enhanced with some extended coverage and improved, I guess, cloud security posture management. some of the things to come out of Ignite as they relate to Azure Security Center include things like a simplified secure score, support for custom policies that went to public preview, and some additional regulatory compliance standards that also went to public preview. Like, for example, the Security Center dashboard will show you how your environment complies with controls and requirements designated by certain regulatory standards. What these announcements included were some, I guess, additional standards that became available. And I'm just looking through my notes here. Microsoft announced that the public preview release includes additional supported standards like NIST SP 853 R4, Canada Federal PBMM, and some other UK specific standards. So there were some announcements regarding Azure Security Center that came out as well. Now, some more significant, at least in my opinion, some more significant announcements that came out regarding Azure Security Center is that it's actually it's expanding its support in the container space to Azure Kubernetes Service or AKS. Now, the new capabilities in the public preview release include things like enhanced discovery and visibility, secure score recommendations, and threat protection. Now, the discovery and visibility capabilities, basically what this includes is a continuous discovery of managed AKS instances within Security Center's registered subscriptions. Now, the secure score recommendations that were added include items that help customers comply with security best practices in AKS as part of that customer's specific secure score. Now, for example, an example of this would be role-based access control should be used to restrict access to a Kubernetes service. So there were definitely some announcements that were interesting that revolved around AKS as they pertain to Azure Security Center. Now, containers also saw some announcements as they relate to Azure Security Center. Now, what came about out of this in Ignite was the ability to also scan container images in Azure Container Registry for vulnerabilities. So that's now something you can do with Azure Security Center. Essentially, the way it works is that Security Center will parse through the packages and other dependencies that are defined in the container image file. It will then check to see whether there are any known vulnerabilities in those packages or dependencies. This is actually powered by a Qualys vulnerability assessment DB. So that's an interesting announcement that came out of Ignite regarding Azure Security Center and the Azure Container Registry. Now, there were some other notable Security Center updates. They included the threat protection for Azure Key Vault in North American regions, and that's gone to public preview, as well as threat protection and vulnerability support for SQL servers that are hosted on Azure VMs. That's another public preview that came out. And one of the more interesting notables is that Qualys vulnerability assessments are now included in Azure Security Center Standard Edition at no additional cost. That, again, is another public preview feature that became available as of Ignite. Now, what I'm going to do is bounce over to the Azure Kubernetes service, and Guy's going to talk a little bit about what came out of Ignite regarding the AKS.
All right, thanks, Tom. Yeah, with Azure Kubernetes service, it's very clear that the Kubernetes juggernaut just keeps on rolling. Kubernetes is taking over everything in IT, it seems like. It's a really important service, not only for Microsoft, but for Google and Amazon and Red Hat and you name it. It's really moving, and Microsoft has fully committed to this. So I'll get into some of the details here. So some of the things that they've added, Azure availability zones for high availability. So even if an entire data center goes down, an Azure data center, then your AKS cluster will stay up. Then they've got cluster autoscaler and multiple node pools. And without getting into the details, these are essentially ways of making the scaling more flexible, providing more options for scaling. Then for Azure Monitor, they've added hybrid monitoring. And what's interesting here is that it used to be you had to use 2 different monitoring systems if you had Kubernetes clusters in Azure and on premises. And now you can actually use Azure Monitor to monitor both of them, so even the on-premises ones, which is pretty cool. And as Tom already mentioned, they've added threat protection for AKS in Azure Security Center. Also authenticated IPs. So if you want to restrict which IP addresses can access your Kubernetes servers, so to make sure that the people who are managing your Kubernetes API servers are actually the right people, you can do that by restricting which addresses can get there. Added some diagnostics. And then on the development side, there's Dev Spaces Connect, which, and this takes a little bit of explaining, and I don't know if I can completely do it right here, but I'll give it a shot. So when you're developing container-based code, particularly for a microservices architected application, then it can be a little bit difficult to test just your one little piece, right? The piece that you're working on, because there are so many other pieces that are involved in this application. And what they've done with Dev Spaces Connect is allow you to have your own bit of code locally that you're debugging, but it can communicate with the code that's in Azure. So not only with Kubernetes, but even some of the other services that are required for this application. So it's this really cool hybrid way of developing container-based applications. So that's pretty impressive. It's kind of difficult to do these things if you don't have some kind of a feature like this. So if you look at this, Microsoft has added features for AKS in high availability and scaling, monitoring, security, diagnostics, and development. So clearly this is a really important service for them going forward, and they just keep adding more and more to it. All right, next. Azure Machine Learning, also very important. And there have been lots of, I would say that they're more on the usability side, the enhancements that were made to machine learning for the most part. So machine learning, Azure Machine Learning has gone through quite an evolution as well. When originally, and this is quite a few years ago now actually, Microsoft came out with Azure Machine Learning Studio, which will always hold a special place in my heart. I really like Machine Learning Studio. It's a really cool way to learn machine learning. There was a problem with it though, in that it was kind of a walled garden. It was, it was a proprietary system, didn't really work with a lot of the open source frameworks and things that came out later. And so, so Microsoft came out with something new called Azure Machine Learning Services, which did work very well in the whole, in the open machine learning world. But what it was missing at the time when it first came out was kind of that nice front end that Studio had. And so the announcements that they made at Ignite seem to be how they're addressing this. Actually, could you go back one more? I still have one more on that. No problem.
There we go.
So there are 3 big new features that they've added. The first one is notebooks. And this, if you're familiar with Python notebooks, it's very similar to that. So it's a really nice way it's a browser-based way to do machine learning experimentation, basically. And so this is a very common way for people to do that using notebooks. So it's been added now to the machine learning services. Automated ML. Now this is really interesting. So the idea here is that if you're not a really experienced data scientist, where you can build and tweak your own models, what you can do with automated ML is you can basically you can give it the data and you can tell it what it is that you're trying to do, what you're trying to solve, and it will automatically try a number of different machine learning models with different parameters and figure out which one is the best to work with your data. And so even though you don't know how to build a model yourself, you can build a quite nicely tuned model by using automated ML. And Designer is essentially a replacement for the old Azure Machine Learning Studio, which I'll get into on the next slide. So this screenshot is, it could either be from Studio or from the new Designer. They're basically the same, the way that the user interface works. And this is drag and drop machine learning. So if you do want to build your own model, but you still maybe don't have all of the experience to be able to code one yourself, you can use all of these pre-built modules, drag them onto the canvas and connect them together and build and train and evaluate your models. It is really neat. And so now they've basically taken Studio and they've moved it into to work with the new Azure Machine Learning Services. And so what they've done is they've taken the old Studio and they've added scalability, version control, enterprise security, and most importantly, in my opinion, they've it's no longer with proprietary formats. It works with non-proprietary formats and deployment targets. So you don't have to deploy it just to the place where Machine Learning Studio allows you to deploy. There are now a number of different options for where you deploy your machine learning models. So I think this is a great addition.
And I guess, Guy, I want to go into the other notable announcements.
Yes, please.
Sure.
So, of course, there were a ton of announcements at Ignite, and we're not going to go through all of them. If you're interested in, let's say, what new virtual machine instance types are out there that have been announced, then you're welcome to go and do that yourself. We're not going to go through all of those, but I'm just going to go through a couple of the ones that I thought were quite interesting. They were pretty notable. Not necessarily the top announcements there, but still very interesting. So let's do that. So the first one is Visual Studio Online. And when I was first learning Azure, and I'd go through the documentation, and in quite a few places on the development side of things, it would have instructions on how you would do things from Visual Studio, which meant you'd need to install it on your local desktop. And I thought, well, if I'm using a cloud service, I really want to do everything in the cloud, basically. And so now with Visual Studio Online, you can do everything there. So it's a browser-based editor. You don't need to install anything locally on your machine. But the interesting thing is that you can still use the desktop-based Visual Studio or VS Code if you want to with Visual Studio Online. So you might be wondering, well, I don't get it then. Why? Like, what is it then if it's not just the browser-based editor? Well, it's an entire development environment online, and so you don't have to use the browser-based editor, but it's a nice way to work with it. But the idea here is that, particularly for teams, especially distributed teams, you can bring up new development environments, multiple development environments online very easily, bring them up, tear them down, and it's almost like, in a way, it's like DevOps for strictly for the development side of things, where it's really easy to bring up these new development environments. And then they're accessible from anywhere, right? You don't have to, lug along your own laptop when you want to access your development environment, because now it's online. So it's accessible by you from anywhere, and also your teammates. So it's really good for collaboration. And it's also scalable. So, if your desktop or your laptop maybe doesn't have enough power to adequately work with the development environments that you have locally, you can just put them on Azure and scale to your heart's content. So I think this is really exciting for the development world. And the next one is Azure Quantum. So this one takes us really to the leading edge or bleeding edge of the computing industry. And I won't go into the details of what quantum computing actually is, because it's pretty different. But quantum computing is fundamentally different from the standard computers that we've been working with for so many decades, and it's it has been quite difficult for people to get any experience with quantum computing. They, you hear the headlines, or you read the headlines, I mean, sometimes, and hear these stories, but to actually work with it is another matter. So what Microsoft has done here is they've brought together a collection of quantum solutions, software and hardware, with partners like 1QBit, Honeywell, IonQ, and QCI. So they brought these solutions all together in Azure so that they're accessible by everybody. And so you can go in and you can write programs with Q#, which is a quantum language that Microsoft originally developed. It's open source, I believe. And the QDK, the Quantum Development Kit. And you can run your code against quantum simulators and even against real quantum hardware. So this is pretty amazing in my mind, that something that's so early in its development is accessible by everybody online like this. And so this is definitely not mainstream yet. This is not something you're going to be putting production workloads on anytime soon. But if you want to get in on the leading edge, then this is a really good way to do it. So that's it for the sort of prepared part of this. And it looks like we have lots of questions coming in. So
Yes,
we should
indeed.
probably get to that.
Yes. So let's start with the first question. What is the competition or similar product for someone or anyone else? I believe this came in when you were talking about Azure Arc.
Right. So if you look at the major cloud providers, AWS has something called Outposts that's been out for a while, and Google has Anthos, and that's still fairly new. Actually, it's not completely out there yet. So those are the competitors. I see that there's another question related to this, so I think I'll just let you ask that, Francesca.
Yeah, can you compare Azure Arc to GCP Anthos? It's like they read your mind.
Yes. And so, yeah, now I have to be honest, I don't know a ton about these hybrid solutions, but I do know a little bit. And so Azure Arc, now, first of all, I should say Azure Arc is still very new. Most of it is still either in preview or yet to come, right? So it's not completely clear what it's going to look like, right? Is that fair, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what they're trying to do with Arc is make it, they want, Microsoft wants Arc to be the pane of glass that manages everything everywhere, whether it's on-prem, whether it's on another cloud. But you're right, everything's preview, it's all brand new. My guess is that, I mean, the Azure portal, which has been in, general for, years now, changes from day to day. So I could imagine that Arc is going to go through some revisions. Typically what Microsoft will do is release some stuff in preview and kind of listen to what people are yiping about and then make those changes. You probably know a little bit more about Anthos than I do. I'm a Microsoft head.
Yeah.
By and large,
Right.
and the Azure Arc thing was really interesting. So it's going to depend really on what happens as a result of some of the preview stuff that comes out when you talk about comparing Arc to Anthos. But generally speaking, they're both looking largely to, I think, accomplish the same things. But as is the case with every service across the major platforms, I think it's going to be a matter of how well each one does it and in what manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so from what I know, they are, as you say, fairly similar in what they're trying to accomplish. One thing that's different, though, I think, is that Anthos is much more focused on containers, which kind of makes sense because Google's the one who came up with Kubernetes and has really been pushing that. And Anthos is kind of built on top of Kubernetes. And so everything is very container focused. With Azure Arc, containers are part of it, but they also seem to be really good about supporting VMs too, right? So it basically covers more than just what Anthos does with containers. So
yeah,
that's what I would say.
when you're supporting servers, there was actually a demo like Azure Arc for servers, I think it was called, and you're going to have an Arc agent to manage existing hardware and VMs. You're also, Kubernetes is going to play a role in Azure Arc, where if one of the demos that we walked through at Ignite was, watching a SQL server be deployed in an on-prem data center. And as you're watching the demo, it's not really apparent out of the gate, but essentially to leverage the real power of Arc, if you're going to want to deploy Azure resources to your on-prem data center, or even to your cloud platform, AWS, GCP, whatever you have, you're going to want to run Kubernetes because you're going to have that platform to deploy to, which is why I said early on, it's almost like you're extending Azure into your data center versus the other way around, which is what everyone else is used to. So Kubernetes and containerization will play a role, but I think over the coming months as Arc matures and starts to become more mainstream, you'll get a better comparison of what the two do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sounds good. We do have another question related to Azure Arc. So is Azure Arc superior to AWS hybrid cloud integration approaches?
Yeah, so AWS Outposts is AWS's hybrid approach. And again, I'm not an expert on that, but what I do know about it is that it's a hardware-based solution. So that actually makes it fairly significantly different from Azure, both Azure Arc and Google Anthos. And I do kind of wonder actually if Amazon is going to come out with something new, because it seems like Google upped the ante with Anthos, and then Microsoft upped the ante even more with Arc. And so I suspect that Amazon is going to try to do something else here too, but they're essentially going to be playing catch up. And it's funny because AWS Outposts has been out for a while, but it's relatively limited in what it does in comparison to these other ones.
Well, I guess we have to wait a couple.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to add one more thing.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see who wins here, right? Because with Kubernetes, everybody adopted Kubernetes, and that's no problem. But with this one, they're all taking somewhat different approaches, and it's not clear yet who's going to win, right? And so I think this is going to be a really interesting battle to watch.
Yeah, I was going to say that we'll probably just have to wait a couple of weeks for AWS reInvent to see what they will come up with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's entirely possible.
All right, we have a couple of more questions. With Azure Arc, it seems like everybody was quite impressed by Azure Arc, huh?
It was big. Yes, it was.
Can you add Windows or Linux servers to the Azure Resource Manager wherever they're running?
Yeah. I mean, that's really the big piece of this, and what I was most impressed with. We saw a couple different demonstrations out at Ignite. One of those was, going into the Azure portal and deploying a VM, like just what you normally do within Azure. But when you go to select the location, you would typically select the location in Azure that would store the metadata for your resource. But then there's another option, another drop down below that, and it's called the Arc location. And in that drop down, you can select your own data center and then deploy your resource. And like I mentioned earlier, I watched a SQL server get deployed in an on-prem environment in 18 seconds or whatever it was. I mean, when you're deploying a SQL server on a physical or even a VM on-prem, that's a multi-hour deal. This actually, it was as simple as deploying a resource in Azure. So you can absolutely deploy VMs regardless of where you want to run them. I mean, you could even do it in your AWS or GCP environment. And the same thing goes the other way. In the context of what I just said, I'm talking about deploying a resource to your data center. If you have an existing data center on-prem, another demonstration we watched was a Microsoft employee actually applying Azure policies to an existing server that lived in an on-prem data center. And that's where the Azure Arc agent comes in. So as far as I'm concerned, it looks pretty game-changing. I mean, of course, everything works, perfect in a lab setting, and the demonstrations were probably run 1,000 times before they went live with them. But from what I could tell, it was when they say single pane of glass, they really mean single pane of glass. You're talking assigning role-based access control to resources, whether they're in Azure or on-prem or in another cloud platform, talking about deploying resources, whether they're on-prem or another platform, managing resources, whether they're on-prem or another platform. It truly, if it does what it's supposed to do when everything's, when the chips are down, Azure Arc looks pretty impressive as a single pane of glass.
All right. Thank you for that, Tom. So we have another question. This time we're changing topic. Does Azure Synapse give you the freedom to query data on your terms using either serverless on demand or provision resources at scale?
Yeah, I think I covered this actually, but maybe I wasn't very clear. You can continue to use the existing option that was for SQL Data Warehouse, which is that you can provision an instance ahead of time to the size that you want, and then you can run queries against that, or you can do this serverless on-demand queries where you don't have to provision anything to start with. So yes, you have both.
Mm-hmm. Cool, yeah. Thank you, Guy. This is probably another one for you, since you were talking about machine learning. Can Azure Machine Learning be used for any kind of machine learning?
Yeah, well, I think it can. It's because it allows you to use open frameworks, particularly Python-based frameworks, but other things as well. Anything that you can, any kind of framework that you can find out there should be able to work with this. I haven't actually seen any use of, let's say, reinforcement learning or some of these other kinds that are not, that are kind of the ones that are really taking off now compared to, say, deep learning with deep neural networks, and standard ones like linear regression and stuff like that. But I'm assuming it can handle reinforcement learning as well. So I think it can handle just about any kind of machine learning. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So we only have time for one last question. From a Kubernetes adoption point of view, any dominant players, Red Hat OpenShift versus AWS Azure EKS versions?
Well, I think really the winner is Kubernetes, right? Kubernetes is just taking over everywhere. And I think what's happening is if you're on Azure, you're using AKS, and if you're on AWS, then actually, I guess it's maybe not quite as clear on AWS because they still have their own container service. And so you kind of choose between the two of them, but still they're getting a lot of adoption with their own Kubernetes service. And same on Google with their Google Kubernetes service, and Red Hat OpenShift is also very successful. We're hearing a lot about that from our customers, but it just seems to me that people will just use whatever Kubernetes service is available, and because it is open source and it's easy to move from one Kubernetes implementation to another, I think they're all doing very well, actually.
Perfect. All right, so Thank you to both Guy and Tom for being with us today. And of course, thank you to all of you for taking some time out of your day to be with us. And thank you so much for all of the questions that you asked. So you will receive the recording of the webinar as soon as it is available. And if you sent us any questions that we weren't able to address, we will answer them via email. In a couple of weeks, we will head to Vegas for AWS reInvent. So if you are going to be there, please stop by the Venetian. We'll be in the Expo Hall at booth 1206. And before we say goodbye, at the end of this session, a quick survey will pop up. We would really appreciate it if you could take 2 minutes to answer the questions and let us know your thoughts on this webinar. Again, thank you everyone, and goodbye.